Hi, my name is Tim Forde, and I'm here with Irish historian, Toastmaster and Storyteller Murt O Suilleabhain. Murt is going to take us through some basics of how you can become a better storyteller. So, Murt, what got you interested in storytelling in the first place?
Well, I suppose, Tim, like most people, as a child, I was always interested in stories, and maybe it is the inquisitive bit in me, but I always wanted to know what would happen at the end of a story. And I suppose that's for me what makes a story, the sort of suspense that you want to know what's going to happen. And I suppose that's how I got interested at first. And then, of course, as you go along, you hear stories from all kinds of places, radio, television, books, everywhere you go, you come across stories. So I just liked them. And then I started telling the other one myself.
So, Murt, I've seen you tell some extremely entertaining stories. How did you learn the art of storytelling yourself?
Well, Tim, I suppose partly by doing it, I'd say, but partly in my case, probably because I heard a lot of stories in my own house. A lot of the older neighbours too. A lot of them would tell stories of the old days, true stories usually, and I found those fascinating. And you can learn a lot from stories, so that's what got me interested, I suppose, really, and held my interest.
And how would you begin preparing a story to deliver to an audience?
Well, you probably heard of Mrs. Beaton, who wrote a very famous cookery book, I think it was, say in the 1600s, Tim. And her recipe for making hare soup started like this. Number one, first catch your hare. And if you were going to tell a story, the first thing is to catch your hare. You have to have a good story. And if you have a good story, a really good story, that's about 95% of all that you need, in my opinion, to tell a story. A good story almost tells itself. So once you've got the good story, you're well away. Now you might say, where do you get stories? You get stories everywhere. You get stories in books, television. You get them from people that you meet in the street and the pub, at work, people that you meet in sports clubs, anywhere at all. I'm sure if you were jogging along or something, you might even your mind might be on storytelling, but you'll see and hear things happening as well. So that I know you're a runner, so that's why I mentioned that. So you get your story, and then you have to make out, of course, that the story hangs together. That is one unit. You don't start in the middle of a story and finish in the middle of it. You make sure you have a story, you tell the story, and that's it basically. The job of a storyteller, you might say, is what? Well, what is the job of a storyteller? The job of a storyteller probably is to rouse interest in the people who are listening, because that's what a storytelling is. You put the main character into the story, and you confront them, if you like, with a certain situation or problem, and there's a conflict maybe, or there's a problem to be solved, and your listeners want to know what happened. That's your story. And once you have that, once you know what your story is about, your job, as somebody said, is to make them laugh, make them cry, make them wait. The waiting is important. The waiting builds up the suspense. And of course, like anything, yourself, you're a good speaker, Tim. You practice it, you rehearse it, you spend time working at it, and try it out on a few people. That's probably the most important thing. Try it out. How does it work? Does it actually work? Do people react well to it? And it has to suit the audience as well, of course.
And what kind of delivery style do you recommend to get the audience interested?
Well, I would say myself now that the best delivery style is to talk, to adopt a very chatty, friendly, relaxed kind of style, as if you were talking in your own home, or to a couple of friends in the pub, or a couple of friends in the club, or a couple of people you meet at work or at lunchtime or something like that. You just tell the story in as simple a way as possible. Use nice, short, straightforward sentences and words. Keep everything simple and normal and friendly and relaxed. And that's the bones of how to give your story.
So simple language, simple sentences.
Absolutely, Tim.
Okay.
Nothing difficult. No involved sentences or very long sentences or anything that people can't bother listening to them. They can't read it, you see. It is different if you have something in front of you, you can read it, look at it. But you can look back over it, but you can't look back over what somebody has said. So it is important to be simple and straightforward.
What about the importance of tone of voice or using dialogue in your story?
Well, there are a few things that are important, I suppose, Tim, as you know yourself, really, in telling a story or giving any speech, whatever. I would think that very important things in a speech are the tone of voice, the pace at which you say something, and the gestures you make, if they're appropriate. And don't be just making gestures for the sake of making gestures. And don't be making huge gestures to a small group. But on the other hand, you can make a large gesture if you're talking to a large group. But you have to keep it nice and simple. And if you get into the mood of a story, I think myself that pace, pause, gestures, and tone of voice tend to follow it. I'm not saying that couldn't be improved on, and if you have record yourself or get a friend to watch you or listen to you, it's all the better perhaps if you listen to what they tell you. But other than that, a lot of it comes from just getting into the mood of the story and letting the story sort of dictate what happens. Because always remember one thing, what's important is not you. A lot of us think of ourselves when we're speaking to people or telling a story or speaking in public. It's not you, it's the story, and it's the people who are listening to the story. They are the people who are important, not you, not ourselves.
So if there was any one piece of advice that you could give people to make their stories more effective or more impactful?
Well, of course, good description is a good thing. If you're describing somebody, if you describe them well, if you use good comparisons in your stories. Somebody say he was as broad as he was long. You know, somebody made more in my shape at that rate, or somebody was as dense as a bag of hammers, which is something I heard on television lately. You know exactly the type of person you're talking about. A bit of humour helps, and the best kind of humour and the safest kind of humour is humour that pokes fun at yourself, because nobody can get offended if you poke fun at yourself, and when you hear people laughing at that, you're quite happy yourself because you want them laughing. So there's nobody offended, really. That is why self-deprecating humour, as they call it, works. Now, there are some stories, of course, which are so sad and so tragic that there should be no laugh. But in lots of stories, it lightens up the thing to have a bit of humour, I would say.
Murt, I've heard you speak before about the power of using pause in a story.
Yes, certainly. I'm glad that you mentioned that, because you know and I know that one of the most important things in a speech is pause. Because when you are saying something, if you were saying something about a person or something, and you're coming on to the words of description, and you just stop before it, people want to know, what is he going to say? You were saying, it was a brilliant day, but people want to know, why wasn't it not brilliant? People want to know, when you pause, you draw people into the story. They want to know, what's he going to say next? And that is how you draw them in, really. Of course, silence gains attention anyway. When you're talking, suddenly there's silence. People are looking around and they're cocking their ears, and you have them listening. But you can, by pausing before something important, you lead them on to it. By pausing after it, you let them think about it. So that pause can work either before something important or something after something important as well.
What's the easiest kind of story to tell if you're just starting out and you want to get into storytelling?
I suppose a very short story probably, Tim, would be my opinion. You tell a very short story would be the first thing, probably the best thing to do at first. Something like a joke. But of course, quite a short story, and as time goes on, you can tell them, make them a little bit longer. And it's always good to put yourself in a story too, you know that, in the sense that if you're talking about the, I went out in the field behind my, sorry, if a fellow was walking down the street yesterday and suddenly he heard a noise. Isn't as good as if you said, I was walking down the street yesterday and suddenly I heard a noise. Because when you put yourself into the story, somebody who was there present with your listeners was in it. It's a lot more immediate for them than saying, well, there was this fella in England 30 years ago and this happened to him. If you personalize it, so to speak, if you can. Some stories you can't. But make as close a connection as possible with the story if you can, whatever that it might be. If you're talking about something important that happened somewhere, if you perhaps start off by saying that last year when I was on holiday, I visited this place. And of course, this is where such a famous thing happened, a famous battle or a famous event in history happened, a famous tragedy or whatever. Those would be some of the things that I would think of.
Do you have a favourite story or a few stories?
Well, like that, I'm glad you asked me that, Tim, because I suppose a lot of us have favourite stories. And I'm not answering you directly, but I'm answering indirectly. Very often, people like me or people who are starting off new prefer to tell true stories because they're more meaningful for the person who is speaking and therefore have a better chance of going across to the person who is listening. So that type of story, a real story, or a story that was told to me as being a true story, I would like that type of story. For instance, in Toastmasters, I was asked to give a story on a folk story. So rather than getting any of the great folk stories of Ireland or the world, I picked out a story that I had heard at home, which turns out to have been a folk story, even though I was told it as a true story. So I was able to give us the setting that I heard it at home. And the same way, another favourite story that I actually gave was something that actually happened to myself, but there isn't time for it here today. And that was very meaningful for me. So that was a story I told. And other stories then would be, I'm interested in history, as you know, and indeed I owe a good deal to you on the history side as well, indeed, Tim. But I've spoken on a number of historical topics, usually of a local nature or ones that I have researched myself so that I know a good deal about them. But it's hard to say any particular. I like stories with a bit of humour in them. If there is genuine humour. For instance, this is a true story. Years ago, when I was a few years younger than I am, a neighbour got into a little bit of trouble. It was a thing that followed the family. They tended to be a bit light-handed when they were young. So his father had got into trouble when he was young and became a very fine citizen afterwards. And this fellow got into trouble. He did a bit of robbery and he got into a little trouble. So the upshot of the reduction was he found it hard to get a job. So he went around to various people to give references, and I was one of them. And knowing the family tradition, I was very happy that he wouldn't do any more. So he went to the priest as well, and I went with him. The priest happened to be in hospital at the time. There was some small thing wrong with him. He was getting a job done on his ears or something. But the priest took a bit of convincing before he'd write a reference for this fella. But eventually, after he extracted lots of promises from this man, I'll call him John Gilhooly, I'll call him. John was all promising he would go straight and so on. And the priest eventually wrote him a reference. When the reference was written for him, John was so thankful, he suddenly felt guilty he hadn't brought anything into the priest in hospital. So when he was getting his letter, he said, "Is there anything I can bring you in, Father?" And the priest said, "No, John, but be sure and don't take anything out." So that's the kind of story I like, because that actually happened. And a story like that, I think, means something to me, and I hope it can get across, to other people.
Yeah, personal stories are
That's right.
very enjoyable to tell and to hear.
Mind you, I find being on camera a bit intimidating, Tim. So I have to apologise there.
Thanks, Bart.
For nothing at all.
That's brilliant.
And thank you for having me.